In the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles issue several similar statements concerning the importance of brotherly love. Now, this is not just the type of physical kinship of blood relatives. It's not just that type of love. It is the love that must exist among people of faith who have been bound together by the blood of Jesus. I want you to notice a few of these statements. The first one's from Jesus himself in John 13, verse 34. He says, I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples. We wonder sometimes why we're having a hard time impacting the world around us. Perhaps it's because sometimes we don't act very loving towards one another. Jesus says people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. This is a necessity in winning people to Christ. In Romans 12 and verse 10, it says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor. Hebrews 13:1 says, let love of the brothers and sisters continue. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 9 and 10 says this, as to the love of the brothers and sisters, you have no need for anyone to write to you. You yourselves are taught by God to love one another. For indeed you practice it toward all the brothers and sisters who are in all Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers and sisters, to excel even more. And then we read 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 in another passage. It says, beloved, let's love one another. I love how it's phrased in the New American Standard. Let's love one another. For love is from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God. This is serious stuff. If you don't love, you don't know God, because God is love. If someone says, I love God, and yet he hates his brother and sister, he's a liar. For the one who does not love his brother and sister whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God must also love his brother and sister. So multiple times this command is issued, and this reminder is extended to disciples. But sometimes I think we need more than just the edict itself. We need more than to hear God's marching orders. We need to see those practices in action. And so for that reason, the Old Testament has great value. Jesus often referred back to examples of the Old Testament to lay down principles for his hearers. And likewise, the Apostle Paul once referred back to several Old Testament accounts. And in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, he says, all these things happen to them as examples. He refers to Old Testament examples. He says, we have these examples for our admonition. We are to be warned and we are to be taught by the Old Testament. And so one such example that I want to share with you here this morning is the friendship and the brotherly love of David and Jonathan. You perhaps know about this story. It's interesting. I have a twin brother. His name is David. He named his son Jonathan. And perhaps because this has some significance to him, the David and Jonathan story. But I want you to think about David and Jonathan, and I want you to see how their friendship really began. Let's think about how it all began. You know, as we consider the root and source of their close-knit and their inevitable friendship, we're going to need to back up a bit further than the typical passages used. And the typical passage most people look at when they study David and Jonathan is 1 Samuel chapter 18. Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 18, you see about Jonathan's soul being knit to David's, that they loved one another, they made a covenant with one another. Jonathan shares his weapons and his robe and his sword with him. They make a commitment to one another that they're going to defend one another. It's a beautiful chapter. We're going to get to it. But we got to see what happens before all that to really see why they have this special relationship that they do. And so if we'll dig deeper, and if we'll notice Jonathan and David separately, we will notice that they are both men of strong faith who had performed acts of valor. Now, a lot of people know about what David did, right? David took those 5 smooth stones and only took one of them. He put them in a sling, swung it, knocks down Goliath, defeats Goliath. We know that. But not as many people are familiar with the fact that Jonathan was actually a great warrior too. He was a great man of faith as well. 2 years into his father Saul's reign, so Jonathan is the son of Saul. Saul is the king of Israel. And 2 years into his father Saul's reign, Jonathan has courage. And if you'll back up to 1 Samuel 13 and verse 3, you'll start to see it. It says that Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. So notice with me that Jonathan is not afraid of the enemy of Israel and thus the enemy of God. The rest of Israel, though, they were afraid. You look at 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 6. It says the rest of Israel went to go hide in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. In other words, the rest of Israel, just a bunch of cowards. They did not want to fight against the Philistines. They were afraid of the Philistines. They are hiding out away from them, cowering in their caves and in their holes. Now, if you turn over a chapter, even though the rest of Israel is afraid, Jonathan's courage is unquenched. So you look at 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 1. It says, it happened one day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who bore his armor, I kind of call them an armor caddy, kind of like on the golf course, you've got a caddy. Here's an armor caddy, just somebody who carries his armor for him. But he says to him, come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. Jonathan has already attacked the Philistines once. The rest of Israel got scared because of what Jonathan did, afraid that it was triggering a war. And Jonathan says, let's go do it again. Once Jonathan arrives, it's pretty awesome when you read the text, and we don't have time to read chapter after chapter after chapter, but what you find is that he climbs up a steep hill with his armor bearer. It takes a very strong person, by the way, to mountain climb. So he's climbing up a steep hill with his armor bearer, and he takes on the entire garrison. The text reads in verses 14 and 15, when you skip on down chapter 14, 14 and 15, it says, that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men within about a half an acre of land. Now, the current property I live on is half an acre. And I cannot imagine finding 20 men to fight and taking them all on by myself, let alone one. I won't even take on my dog in my own yard sometimes. Okay, but Jonathan, this tells you what kind of a man he was. He was courageous. He was unafraid. Now, the key, the most important thing is this, because otherwise this just turns into another Rambo type story. Okay? Why was Jonathan so confident that he could defeat the enemy while the rest of the army was shaking like a leaf? And the answer is in chapter 14 and verse 12. Verse 12 says, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. Jonathan's courage stems from his faith in a mighty and a powerful God. Now that sounds pretty similar to the guy that we know a lot better, David, right? Because Jonathan's storyline is very similar to David's. So as we fast forward a couple of chapters, David has left his sheep, because he's a shepherd, to go see what is going on with the Israelite encampment, and he hears Goliath taunting the army. You read about that in 1 Samuel 17, verses 19 through 23. Goliath is taunting them, and no one from the army wants to take on mighty Goliath. In fact, in verse 24, you read about the response. The response from the men of Israel to Goliath is when they saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Doesn't that sound very similar? Jonathan was very brave. Everyone else was scared. David is very brave. Here's what Goliath is doing, but everyone else from Israel is afraid. David's response, if you skip on down to verse 37, is not one of fear. David's response is one of confidence in God. And so he says in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And God does. In fact, the first time Jonathan ever meets David, I want you to imagine this. David is carrying the head of Goliath in his hand. Can you imagine carrying someone's head, perhaps by the hair of the head, and David's just walking in with the head of Goliath? And here's the cool thing. This is this typical men for you, right? Jonathan's like, I love that guy. That's what the last verse of chapter 17 is all about in the first verse of chapter 18. Jonathan just thinks, wow, this David is awesome. Why is he awesome? Not because he's a murderous man or anything like that. No, it's because he sees that David, like him, is someone who has incredible faith in God, and he's not a coward. You know, this is very important to understand, and here's why. Because there are some people in our world who are turning the story of David and Jonathan into something that it's not. They're turning it into some kind of a romance or bromance, as it's sometimes been termed. That is not what's going on in 1 Samuel 17 and 18. These men, by the way, would both have wives. These men would have children. These men would make a promise to take care of one another's children when you read 1 Samuel 20, verse 15. But the homosexual movement would have us believe this was some sort of monogamous commitment to gay marriage that's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 18. That is a perversion of Scripture from perverted minds. Okay, sometimes when we see the word love, we can't help but think of sex. That's not in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And don't let somebody put that in there for you. It was two men who had bold faith in God, who had rare courage, admiring one another's faith and works and committing to brotherly love and friendship as they served God together in the nation of Israel. That's what's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Well, that's how it all began. But I want you to consider what's so amazing in many instances about the fact that they stayed friends is that there were so many obstacles to their brotherly love and their friendship. So let's think about some of those. One of the things that makes the account of the brotherly love between David and Jonathan so admirable is the challenges that it faced and that it had to overcome. One of the first challenges would be this. One of the first obstacles is the obstacle of jealousy. You know, Jonathan's father, Saul, could not love David as he should have because he was too jealous of him. Take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 9. And after Jonathan and David make this agreement that they're going to be loyal to one another and so on, look at verse 6. It happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine. This is after he had defeated Goliath. That the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. Now, King Saul's not the one who defeated Goliath, David is, but they're still giving King Saul some of the credit because he's considered the commander of the army. And the women sang as they danced, they said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, you think Saul would be kind of happy with that. Wow, this is a great moment. Our arch enemy has been, at least the leader of the arch enemy, has been defeated. The Philistines, for the first time in a long time, are afraid of us. So the situation's been reversed. We've got a quick battle victory here. But Saul's not happy. In verse 8, Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. He didn't like that. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s? And to me, they have ascribed only thousands. Now, what more can he have but the kingdom? And so Saul eyed David from that day forward. Now, as news of David's defeat of Goliath spreads, David is offered high praise. Higher praise, really, than Saul. And Saul couldn't stand it. And he eyed David from that day forward. I want to tell you something. We cannot love our brethren. It will be an obstacle to our love if we are jealous of them. If we are jealous of their abilities, because we conceive that their abilities are greater than ours, or if they are praised for their abilities more than we are, we cannot love our brethren as we ought. If we are jealous of their beauty, if we are jealous of their talent, if we are jealous of their recognition with regard to something, if we're jealous of their money, if we're jealous of the position that they hold, we cannot love our brethren as we ought. It's an obstacle to brotherly love. And Saul fell into that trap of allowing the obstacle to overcome him. Another obstacle that we find that Jonathan overcame was the obstacle of family pressure. Family pressure. Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 20 for a moment. And King Saul, you'll find there, is not only jealous of David, and it's not good enough that he be jealous of David. He wants everyone else to be jealous of David too. And so when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 20, you find that he pressures Jonathan through insult and threats to break off his friendship. Look at verse 30, and Saul says to Jonathan, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Wow, I wonder what Jonathan's mom thought of that. "Do I now know that you have chosen the son of Jesse," that'd be David, "to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" That's a fun dinner table conversation, right? But here's the real point of it. Jonathan's being pressured by Saul to hate David, and Jonathan doesn't give in to the pressure. It is hard, though, when you do have families pressuring you in that way. It is hard to love others as we ought when our families are at war. Think Romeo and Juliet. Isn't that what it's all about? Capulets and Montagues and all that sort of thing. Think Sharks and Jets if you're like that. Parents have an influence on how their kids think, and it takes a very rare person to overcome that influence. When we are at war over politics, for example, that can sometimes influence the children as well. When we are at war in the church, when we're at war over something that's silly, and I've seen this happen over Little League playing time, you can turn your children's love into hatred. How many parents have talked bad about some little 6-year-old on a soccer field or on a baseball team that they thought their kid was better than, and it ruined the relationship of the kids as well as the parents? You cannot love brethren, one another, as you ought if you are jealous and if you are applying that type of family pressure. It is difficult to overcome. But Jonathan did overcome it. There's also the obstacle of a competitive spirit. King Saul reveals the real reason Jonathan should hate David. And he tells him in verse 31, the real reason, Jonathan, you should hate David is because he's a threat to the throne. You know, I'm the king right now, Jonathan. I'm your father. You're my son. Once I'm dead, you could be the king. But if you keep this friendship going with David, one day he's so popular, they're going to make him the king instead of you. You should hate him. Look at verse 31. As long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. It's hard to show brotherly love when we act as though we are competing with our brethren and we are jockeying for position. One of the things we need to understand is, brethren, there is plenty of work to do in God's kingdom for all people. And instead of trying to take out the competition, we should be trying to lift one another up. But it happens in life, doesn't it? You know, we badmouth the coworker because they might take our promotion, so we need to find a way to undermine them and make them look bad. You can't love your coworker as you ought if you've got a competitive spirit with them. We slander the new girl because we think that she's prettier than we are, so she might come and take our boyfriend. insult other preachers sometimes to try and lift ourselves up as better than the rest because we think that's going to help us get more popular. We're all playing for the same team. We're all wearing the same blood-stained jersey. Instead of tearing one another down, we should be working to build one another up in the kingdom. There is a better and more honorable way to live than this. And so it's a challenge to brotherly love, and we are in competition with one another. Let me notice a fourth challenge with you, and it's the obstacle of self-will. The obstacle of self-will. King Saul wanted so hard to have it his way, but he knew eventually the Lord was going to make a way for David. Jonathan says as much in 1 Samuel 23 and verse 17. This is when David is hiding out in the wilderness because King Saul and his troops are trying to find him. And Jonathan finds a moment to sneak over and have a conversation with David, and he says this to him in verse 17. Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that. How did Saul know that? I would suggest to you Saul knows that because Saul was told that by God himself. God told him, I'm removing the kingdom from you. There's going to be someone else who's going to become the king. Saul knew what God's will was, but Saul was so self-willed, he wouldn't let God's will rule. It is foolish to fight against God. But that's what Saul was doing. It infected the relationship between him and David. But Jonathan saw through it. A self-willed person who must always have his own way and who is willing to defy God and his will to have their own way is one of the most dangerous and destructive people that you will ever meet. Jonathan had to overcome all of these forces to still display his right hand of fellowship and friendship to David. And this is what makes him such a remarkable character. Too many people allow jealousy, a competitive spirit, family pressure to ruin their relationship with God and with his people. And so these are some of the obstacles that Jonathan had to overcome. Well, here's some of the obstacles. That's kind of the bad news. Well, what is brotherly love then? Part of it is overcoming the obstacles that could divide us. But let's take a look at what some of the attributes of brotherly love are between David and Jonathan. Let's start with this. Back up to chapter 18. And notice with me verses 1 and 3 of 1 Samuel chapter 18. When he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Take a look at verse 3. Jonathan and David then made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. These two men, first of all, you will find, are unafraid to express their deep friendship and their loyalty to one another. That's part of brotherly love. Now, the term knit, when I read that term knit, reminds me of what unity is. The idea of being knit together is being united together. It reminds us of unity, and that's something that has to exist among us as brethren. In John chapter 17, one of the things that Jesus actually prayed for before his death, in verse 20, he says, I don't pray for these alone, but for those who will believe in me through their word. The these that he talks to about first was his apostles. He says, I also pray for the people who become believers because of the apostles. That's you and me. I believe in Jesus because of what the apostles wrote and testified. But Jesus was praying for the apostles, and he was praying for you and me here. He says that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may be one in us. Now, the in us is key. It's not just this unity, this kind of agree to disagree type unity. It is unity that is based upon God first, and when we all have vertical unity with God, we will have horizontal unity with one another. He says, and when that happens, the world will believe that you sent me. Sometimes we've been hurt, and sometimes we are too afraid to get close to other people because we have been hurt, because we have been burned by someone, because we have tried to express love and commitment and friendship and loyalty, and somehow someone has let us down. But this passage teaches us that we need to be people who are united, who are loyal, who are committed to each other in doing God's will, despite what's happened in the past. And I want to suggest to you that here we are as brothers and sisters in this assembly today, and I'm kind of a newbie here, obviously, only been here for a little over a month. But I want to suggest to you that if every local church member could make this type of covenant with the fellow members of the local church and with me, we'd see far less division and far more reconciliation as issues arise. We need to be the type of people who say, you're my brother and sister in Christ. I want to be united with you, and I am not going to let anything come between us. We're going to put God first, and we're going to be united with one another. And when things do arise that we see as a threat and as a danger, we need to realize where it's coming from. It's coming from Satan, and we need to tell each other, we're not going to let this divide us. We're going to work through this, and we're going to get through this, and we're going to be united at the end of it. And we need to have that type of commitment. It's the type of commitment David and Jonathan had with one another. There's also a second thing that I would share with you about David and Jonathan, and Jonathan specifically shows us that, and that is that Jonathan valued others above himself. Do you realize what's being symbolized in verse 4 when Jonathan takes off the robe, likely the royal robe that he was wearing? He gives it to David when he takes off his armor that he only had because the Philistines had not allowed them to have blacksmiths in the land. Nobody else had armor except Jonathan and Saul. It was a rare thing to be carrying around a sword in these days. That's probably why Jonathan was a pretty good archer. That's the type of attack they had to use because they were very limited in their weaponry. But Jonathan takes his sword, and he takes his bow, and he takes his belt, and he takes his robe, and he gives it to David. In total humility. What this was saying is that I rank you and your position higher than I even do myself, even though I'm the next in line to be king. But since God has chosen you, I'm going to go ahead and let you know that I rank you higher than me. Brotherly love involves putting our brethren's needs above our own. I think that's part of what you see going on here with Jonathan and David. In Philippians chapter 2, turn with me to the New Testament because we want to try to seal up a little bit of what we learn here with some New Testament teaching. Philippians 2 and verse 3 says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit." If Jonathan had been selfish and conceited, he would never have given David what he gave him. "But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself." And that's what Jonathan does here. You're better than me. You're going to be greater than me. It says, let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. When we have brotherly love, we will value others above ourselves. And so when others are in need, we're going to be willing to take from what we have, our treasure stores, and we're going to share with those who are in need. When the other people need our time, we're going to be willing to take some of our time, and we're going to be able to share it and willing to share it with others who are in need of our time. When the church is in need of our talents and our abilities, we're going to be willing, because we want to glorify God and we want to edify other people, we're going to be willing to sacrifice our earthly and worldly ambitions for the glory of God and for his church. And we're going to give of our time and our treasures and talents for the sake of the church. Unity begins with humility. Unity, if you look at the word and how it's spelled, you, think about it this way, you begins the word, and it's before I. And that's what it's going to take to be united. It takes humility, and it takes putting you before I. Jonathan does that. He values others above himself. He also protects others from harm. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 19. 1 Samuel chapter 19, notice verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. It says in verse 1, "Now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David." So what does Jonathan do? Jonathan realizes that a hit has been put out on David. And Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. And so Jonathan told David, saying, "My father, Saul, seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. I will speak with my father about you, and what I observe I will tell you." Jonathan knows that his father has an evil plan for David, and he lets David know to protect him from harm. That's another thing that brotherly love does. The scriptures show us there's certainly situations where our brothers and sisters may be in harm's way. For example, the one sheep leaves all the rest of the other sheep, and he's down in a pit. He goes astray. He's in a dangerous position. What does a good shepherd go and do? A good shepherd goes and finds the lost sheep and wants to bring them back into a situation of safety, protecting the sheep from harm. And that's something that we have to do for one another. You know, we sometimes think when brothers and sisters might be pointing out some type of a sin in our lives, we sometimes think that that's motivated by hatred, that they're being judgmental, they're being rude to us. And instead of thinking that way, we need to realize that perhaps they're doing it motivated out of love because they're protecting us from harm. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Evil companions corrupt good morals." So if you're running around with evil companions, look, I got 3 teenagers. If they're running around with kids that I know are trouble and are toxic, I might let them know. I'm not doing that to be mean to my kids. I'm doing it because I love my kids. I don't want to see you get in trouble. I don't want to see you run into sin. Love protects other people from harm. The most loving thing that a person can do is warn you of physical and spiritual danger. And that's what Jonathan is doing here with his friend David because of Saul. And so brotherly love protects others from harm. Brotherly love also passionately speaks up for the righteous. Sometimes people perhaps deserve their punishment. One of the thieves on the cross said that when they were on the cross with Jesus. He says, we deserve being on the cross here. Jesus doesn't. We deserve our punishment. David here, who was a type of Christ, by the way, David here didn't deserve the punishment that Saul was measuring out to him. And because of that, Jonathan speaks up for him. Look at 1 Samuel 19 verse 4. Jonathan, when he does come to Saul, spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, "Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good towards you." Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation and somebody was speaking evil and putting down someone else, and you knew in the back of your mind, they don't deserve what you're dishing out? But perhaps you were afraid to speak up and say something. If you've got brotherly love and someone is being slandered, people are backbiting against that person, people are gossiping about that person, people are unjustly, through their words, maligning them, then speak up for the one who is righteous. Speak up and address that. Jonathan is willing to do that with Saul. It says in verse 6, notice this, Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan. And Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be killed." So that persuasion at least slows down Saul for a period of time. Of course, he'll go back to it. The scriptures show us a constant pattern of the persecution of the righteous. And, we can't defend the persecuted prophets or the martyred apostles, but we can, in brotherly love, speak up for our brethren who can be unjustly persecuted for righteousness' sake. And we should speak up for them. What else goes on here with Jonathan that shows brotherly love? Well, he sympathizes and he shows affection. Look at 1 Samuel 20, verses 41 and 42. In verse 41, as soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face toward the ground, and bowed down 3 times. Now, what happens here is that Jonathan and David had a sign that they had worked out with one another to alert David if harm was going to be intended towards David. then Jonathan would shoot the arrows out further than where David was hiding behind the rock. And when David sees that he shot the arrows beyond where he was, the two of them for one last time, before David has to flee and run away, the two of them for one last time come together and console one another. Can you imagine that for a minute, by the way? I had a friend who grew up in the Chicago area, and he converted from Islam to Christianity. And when he converted from Islam to Christianity, he was immediately, at the age of 18, cast out of his house, kicked out. Thankfully, I think the brethren took him in for a period of time. Thankfully, he was the valedictorian of his class, and he had a full ride scholarship to go to the University of Illinois, and he was able to go there and had somewhere to live and had brethren there who cared for him. But can you imagine being 18 years old and just suddenly, because you've decided to live your life for Jesus, you're booted, you're kicked out, they're done, you're cut off. What a sad situation. And I imagine that these brethren who took him in, after they realized what had happened, I imagine that there was weeping, I imagine there was tears, and certainly there was much, much compassion understanding the situation that he was in. That's a situation, in a way, that David's in. David has to leave the city. Saul is going to murder him if he stays there. He is a man who has a target on his head, and so he's got to go. And yet, Jonathan is the son of Saul. What's he going to do? Jonathan is still going to be loyal somewhat to his father up to a limit. He'll be loyal, but he will not violate God's will in getting rid of David, who is God's next anointed. And so it's a difficult situation. And Jonathan and David show sympathy and affection towards one another in that situation. Look at verse 41. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, bowed down, and they kissed one another. People, again, turn this into something perverted. This is what people did in this culture as they greeted and comforted and consoled one another. They were willing to, we don't do that today. Somebody kisses you on the cheek in America, we think that's kind of weird, especially during COVID, right? We don't even want to shake somebody's hand. But this was what they did. And they wept together, but David more so. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, between your descendants and my descendants forever." Again, was this some type of a homosexual romance that they were having? They were never going to have children? No, they talk about their descendants in verse 42. Planned to have children, and David had many of them. And David took care of one of Jonathan's children in his old age. What we see here is sympathy, though, and affection. If you're not close enough to others that you can rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, then maybe we need to be developing stronger relationships. When Paul left Ephesus after 3 years, one of the most beautiful unspoken of passages is in Acts 20, 36 and 37, I think. And that is, after just 3 years of working together, they all wept freely and fell on Paul's neck and kissed him, sorrowing most of all that they would see his face no more. They had developed such a strong bond and fellowship and relationship with one another that when it's time for him to go, they're crying. They're weeping because they love their brother. One of COVID's greatest tragedies has been the death of the handshake and the hug and smiles that are covered by masks. We need appropriate affection from one another. We need that. That's part of brotherly love. And so brotherly love sympathizes, it shows affection, and it also strengthens. In 1 Samuel 23, they will again meet each other. We read this a little bit earlier, but they will meet each other in the forest while David is hiding out. And while David's on the run, Jonathan finds him and offers him words of encouragement during that time. Within the word encouragement is the word courage. And there are times in our faith that our courage begins to fail. And the goal of encouragement is to help us fire it back up again. That's what Jonathan does for David here. Also important to note is that Jonathan's strength was within God's divine will. He strengthens him. He says, God knows that you're going to be the next king. This is God's will. And so it's okay. It's okay. It's going to be okay. I want you to think of a dark and difficult time in your life where things were difficult. I don't know. It might have been when you were a teen. A lot of people, we have tough times in our teen years or in our college years. It may have been a time when you're going through a marriage problem. You may be going through some type of a marriage problem. Maybe when you're parenting teens, it's kind of where I'm at now. Maybe when you're trying to be the caregiver for an older family member who's got cancer, or they're shut in, or they're homebound, and it is so difficult for you. But I want you to think of someone who, while you were going through that time, who made a difference and just said something to you that helped you get through. One of the greatest things that sometimes people say to me after a sermon is, that's exactly really what I needed. Not just good sermon, but that for what I'm facing right now, right here today, that is exactly what I needed to hear to get me back moving again. And right here in 1 Samuel 23, that's what Jonathan does for David. I would encourage you to think about someone who's going through that sort of difficulty in their life right now, and go be someone's Jonathan this week. Be that person that they need to hear encouraging, strengthening words from, and stabilize them, realizing what they're going through and battling in their life. But here's the last point that I would make about Jonathan. It's this: because Jonathan was all those things, he lived in a way that when he died, he was truly missed. Eventually, Jonathan dies alongside his father in battle with the Philistines. And it's amazing that despite the fact Saul had caused a lot of pain in David's life, David offers high praise to both Saul and Jonathan. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 1, and notice verse 17. It says, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. Skip on down to verse 26. Verse 25, it says, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. That's why we're calling this brotherly love. They weren't physical brothers, but they were brothers in the faith, brothers for God. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. David was not sad because of Jonathan's death, but because he had lost a friendship, which actually was a better friendship than his marriages. And if you study David's marriages, you'll see why he said that. He had some rough marriage issues. When we live and when we exhibit brotherly love, the result at our death is great sadness from those we exhibited our love to in this life. I think of Tabitha, also called Dorcas in Acts chapter 9, who we mentioned last week. She lived in a way that when she was gone, she was missed. And when we exhibit brotherly love, look, friends, when we are gone, we will be truly missed. Well, we're about out of time. I want to finish up with a contrast of Saul and Jonathan, because I want you to choose the better way as you live out your life and you live out your week. Because as we look at Saul and Jonathan's actions toward David, we see a stark contrast. Saul said, I will fight him. Jonathan said, I will love him. Saul said, David must die. Jonathan said, David must reign. Saul said, David must decrease. Jonathan said, David must increase. Saul throws his spear at David. Jonathan lays down his sword for David. Brotherly love. It's not found in the actions of the Sauls in the world. It's found in the actions of Jonathan. And so in a world full of Sauls, people who are competing, people who are jealous, people who like to tear other people down, be a Jonathan. I want to conclude by turning our focus to Jesus, the friend of sinners. David, the shepherd king, is just a shadow of Jesus, the good shepherd and the King of kings. In our lives, with respect to Jesus, we can either be a Saul or we can be a Jonathan. We can either fight to protect the throne of our lives, or we can quit resisting the king of our lives, and we can lay our arrogance and our self-will aside to humbly serve King Jesus.